Welcome, everyone. I'm delighted to welcome you to the School of Architecture at the University of Virginia and to today's event celebrating the launch of Nana Last's book, Archive Matrix Assembly, The Photography of Thomas Struth. And I'll just hold up the book for you to see. The book was published last year by Applied Research and Design, an imprint of Oro Editions, and was supported by a publication grant from the Graham Foundation. And today we have the distinctive and really exciting opportunity to take part in a conversation between the author, Nana Last, and the artist, Thomas Struth. My name is Sheila Crane, and I'm chair of the Architectural History Department here in the School of Architecture. And I have the pleasure of moderating today's conversation between Nana and Thomas with my colleague, Andrew Mondschein, who is Associate Dean of Research and Associate Professor of Urban and Environmental Planning here at UVA. Andrew's research explores the rapidly changing terrain of transportation and information technologies, questions to which he brings deep theoretical engagement, not least through his exploration of the perceptual and experiential aspects of mobility and infrastructure. So I'm going to begin today's events by introducing our speakers, and then Andrew and I will launch a conversation between Nana and Thomas with a series of questions. And towards the end of our time together, we'll open the floor to the audience for you to pose questions to our speakers. So let me begin with a couple of brief introductions. I know many of you need no introduction, but it brings me great pleasure to introduce my dear friend and colleague, Nana Last, Associate Professor of Architecture here at UVA, and founding director of the PhD in the Constructed Environment. In her role guiding the PhD program and through her capacious understanding of theory as an interdisciplinary tool for understanding connections across seemingly disparate realms, Nana has indelibly reshaped the School of Architecture's intellectual terrain and potentials. A consummate writer, exacting thinker, and generous interlocutor, Nana has taught many of us the power of the diagram as a tool for thinking and for structuring ideas. She's published widely on architecture and philosophy, contemporary art and architecture, as well as on the intersections between science, technology, and narrative. In addition to the book we're celebrating today, Archive Matrix Assembly, Nana is the author of Wittgenstein's House, Language, Space, and Architecture, which was first published in 2008 by Fordham University Press. And she's currently working on a new book project, From Text to Algorithm, Architecture and Big Data, a project that she's working on in part in dialogue with Andrew Mondschein. It's also a real honor to welcome Thomas Struth back, at least virtually, to the University of Virginia for this event. As many of you know, Thomas lives and works in Berlin, but his photography is the product of wide-ranging forays to far-flung cities and sites. Struth studied painting and photography at the Kunstakademie in Düsseldorf, but from an early moment ventured further afield, becoming in 1978 the first artist in residence at PS1 in New York. Much more recently, major retrospectives of Struth's work have been held at the Guggenheim Museum in Bilbao in 2019 and the Haus der Kunst in Munich in 2017, following on his comprehensive solo exhibition in 2016, Nature and Politics, inaugurated at the Museum Folkwang in Essen before traveling to Berlin, Atlanta, Houston, and St. Louis. An earlier major retrospective of Struth's work opened in 2010 at the Kunsthaus Zurich before traveling to Düsseldorf, London, and Porto. In addition, important solo exhibitions have taken place in leading international institutions too numerous to name here, However, it's worth noting that Thomas Struth was the first contemporary artist to have his work shown at the Museo del Prado in Madrid. And his works are in leading collections around the world, including the Museum of Modern Art in New York, the Tate in London, the Centre Pompidou in Paris, the Hamburger Bahnhof in Berlin, and many others. And in the context, perhaps, of today's conversation, it is perhaps striking to note a small detail of Thomas Struth's biography. But I thought it was telling that he has been awarded honorary fellowships from both the Royal Institute of British Architects and the Royal Photographic Society, which seems to me a really interesting testament to his own engagement across the terrain of art and architecture. So we're really privileged today to have a really quite distinctive and rare opportunity to hear from the author and writer of a book and the subject of the project, the artist, and to have them speak in conversation with us about their intersecting and distinctive projects. So while we continue to view a selection of Thomas Struth's photographs, including many that are discussed in the book, I'd like to invite you, Nana, to begin by orienting us to your project. I think it's really important that the introduction to the book you title The Larger Project of Non-Separation. So I'm hoping you might lead us into the book by way of this framing and tell us a little bit about the relationship of that framework to the key terms of the book's title, Archive, Matrix, Assembly.
Thank you, Sheila, so much for that really lovely introduction. And yes, I think it's probably most useful if I do sort of say a little bit about that. And you hit on a key term, this idea of this larger project of non-separation. So the book itself really looks at Thomas Struth's photography, and it proposes that over the past 40 plus years, it has evolved through these three stages that are the title: archive, matrix, and assembly. And I really offer each term as an analytical description that characterizes both the individual photographs and their relationships to each other, really focusing on the ways in which they become meaningful. So while the book chronicles the evolution of the work, really its conceptual starting point is the entirety of work, this immense numbers and sort of viewpoints of these photographs. And I see these three stages then against this, forming what I call the larger project of non-separation. So what do I mean by this? Well, it means that I approach the work in one way very differently than I think many people have written about it, which tend to focus on one sort of related series of photographs or one topic as almost in isolation from the other ones. And what I do is take a radically different tack by both sort of trying to tackle this body of work in its entirety, but really importantly, by proposing that the discontinuities and the continuities are both equally important in the work. And so I look at how the frequent jumps in subject matter between images plays a central role in the development of not just the work at whole, but within images, like the series intermix in that way. And towards this, although the book talks about these three stages, there's a lot of themes that go between them, like things like subjectivity. So how people are seen and what the human is and the role we're addressing them is very different as it develops, but continues in its importance, as does some other big themes like history. So just very quickly, the three stages against this is first this archive stage. And it's the one that is more how we might traditionally think of an archive, at least starting. And so here you might think of yes, exactly, thank you. The central perspective, small black and white streetscapes that are central perspective, that are largely devoid of people, and that replicate that approach. After that, there's a whole series of other things that potentially start as archives, like portraits or a museum series, but that readily break down that distinction. So whereas it starts maybe at that model, the absolute introduction of continuous new archives fundamentally interact. And that gets to the matrix stage, which I see as less about necessarily introducing all new content, but reimagining and rethinking and the way these various other images work together. So in this, for example, the museum photographs that initially photographed people from behind viewing art in museums in a series from 2004 and 2005, I think, called Audience. We all suddenly see the viewers face on, almost as if from the viewpoint of the art rather than the focus on the art. And that, I think, creates something like a hybrid almost between portraits and the museum series, and a whole new way of viewing each of those categories. And then finally, is the assembly stage, which includes a huge proliferation of topics, everything from technology, the space shuttle, Disneyland rides, patients in operating rooms, sort of all these photos of these entangled masses of complexity of devices, and as well as things like the deceased animals in a zoological lab. And I use the word assemblage or assembly here to describe the focus on these complexes that are being shown, like scenes of production or scenes of the creation of these technological things, and as well as beyond, but also use the word assembly to look at how the images work together, almost as different parts of their own assembly. And one can cluster them slightly differently, but that they work in relationship to each other. They change scale, they change perspective. And some of those groups go across multiple sites, and some really focus from within one origin. And so really, in many ways, I think of the assembly as a kind of meta matrix. It's talking about operations. It's talking about that act of assembly. And if I can just end with, since we were talking about this larger project, because I feel like at the end, we don't have a series of just discrete photographs. We have this very complex, meaningful, ongoing enterprise, this evolving system of thought, really, that I call the larger project of non-separation. And I begin, there's audience, I begin the introduction with a quote from William James, and I'm not going to read the whole thing here, but I love the ending point because it has a kind of spirit that I think I find here, where he says something like, as though the unity of things and their variety were different orders of truth and vitality altogether. And I feel like that's what I see and what I've so appreciated in this work.
Thank you. Thank you, Nana. One of the notable and satisfying aspects of this book is the way in which it presents a shared intellectual project. There's an exciting entanglement of ideas spanning photography and writing that constitute this, if I can use the word, assembly. Despite that, you both operate autonomously, and the trajectories or vectors that represent your work originate from different points. As we dive deeper into the ideas contained in the book, I'd first like to ask, what sparked the initial dialogue that led to this book? What caused you to become attracted to the other's trajectory? Thomas, would you be willing to talk about that first?
Yes, while I was listening to Nana, what came up in me was the thought that what I was in the beginning when I switched to photography and you entered that practice and you've did different experiments that were partly related to what subject matter or pictorial things I was practicing. In my painting, I felt like I'm really interested in making pictures where things don't slip out of my hand, yes, don't slip between my fingers. And yes, so that's why I'm always interested. I'm always trying to say something truthful, sort of kind of analysis in a conscious summary of what I find important, and you to melt it in one picture in a way, so that is always an accumulation of what I've been thinking about. For example, in this picture, these are all drones, and the dinosaurs is a toy that when you stroke it, it starts to make sound. And I learned that the scientists or developers who work on the drones, they always get toys sent from the toy industry because they hope that they make more exciting toys. So in one way, so to hold on to something, and that is valid for the entire body of work, like the principal idea of what a new body of work. It could be about, which is mostly very personal thing, but also something, it contains always the thought of sharing it. So what's the general, what could be the general value of that for everybody, like a shared experience? And in that respect, I find assembly a very beautiful word, and non-separation, because your things cannot be separated. Nothing exists in a completely separated way. So that's just part of the human condition, or the universal condition. So it started all by an article that Inanna had written in an architecture magazine that really surprised me, and I thought, wow, finally somebody understands my practice or my incentives, and finds different words or different, more complex the description of what I'm interested in. Also, I think if you would do that, if you would apply this method of analysis to other artists, you would find surprising things. Maybe it's not as evident as in my work, but it's certainly embedded in many artists' work in a way. It may be less explicit, but I think it's totally normal that things are built upon each other, and who would not have the best memory of the entire body of work than the person who created it. And so there's also something from very young age. I had the privilege or the happenstance that I grew up between age 10 and 19, very nearby Cologne. So, and my father worked for a bank right in front of the Cologne Cathedral. So when after school, when I used to go to the city and you hang out in the Museum Ludwig there, then I would go to my father's office and drive back with him back home. I spent a lot of time at the museum between the age of like 14, 15, 16, 17, and so on. And just let these artistic works of art, and also of course then looking at the careers and how people had developed their work. And you very early notice these things. Some artists always do the same, some artists change a lot, it's the characteristics of work and so forth. So I always wondered about this, what does that mean, or why is it like that?
Thank you. Yeah,
So the article then, I mean, to finish that, the very strangely long, extended, branching out answer. I contacted Nana. We met in New York, and we started to see each other. And she came to Düsseldorf when I was still there, and for a week to look at everything at the studio. And then it started to develop in a longer, longer book project.
Thank you very much. And I think it's wonderful to get your lens into this project. I think, Nana, to some degree, you in the book itself kind of convey how you enter into this common project. So I appreciate the parallelism that you've allowed here by telling us about that, Thomas. But Nana, if there's anything you'd like to add to that.
I mean, we've never really, I've never heard Thomas say before this, like, as a method that could be applied. And I think he's right. But what's interesting is that his work prompted the method and made that so clear. And so it prompted a way of thinking. And for me, that was, I went to a retrospective that was in Dallas from 2002 and brought my then 19-month-old son with me. And we, and I expected to see the streetscapes and the museums and some other things, but I, on the outside of the wall leading to the rooms that held the retrospective was one of the Paradise series, one of those all over green foliage things. And I immediately thought two things. One of how does this relate as a question? I immediately had an answer. It kind of overwhelmingly talked of itself and as a conversation, as a set of related charged ways of seeing the world that each had this interest in each other, and this kind of article formed itself. So that was sort of a lot for me to sort of overwhelmingly feel that way. And it took some years before I wrote that and to get out. And so this was all, and in all of that, I have to add that Thomas has been so generous in many ways, but also he's always said, write whatever you write, that is, and so it's a true conversation, or it's a true dialogue with the images. And even though I've learned a lot from him, it's always about that. And I like very much, I think the book reads that way, as a relationship and it's designed that way, as a relationship between a set of images and a discussion of them.
Maybe to pick up on that thread a little bit, Nana, I'd love to hear you. There's an interesting moment near the end of the book in the assembly phase where you specifically kind of confront the writing of Benjamin Buchloh and his seeing what was then Thomas's more recent work as anomalous in relationship to earlier work. And you use that to precisely really bring home the point that we fail to really understand Thomas Struth's photographic project and the intellectual stakes of that by seeing it through the lens of the kind of conventional categories of art criticism and art history bound to genre and content. So I'd love to hear you reflect a little on kind of what the framework opens up for you in an engagement with thinking art theoretically. And maybe also to Thomas to reflect a little bit more on what it means as an artist when you put your work in the world, to have it mirrored back to you through the readings and frameworks of others.
Well, okay, that's a complex question, but it's also interesting because Benjamin Buchloh is a kind of ancestor in a certain way, in the sense that we both know him And I think he was a teacher to both of us in 2 different countries at 2 different times. So, and it's certainly asked things very specifically from an art critical stance and from a particular frame he has, which I must say, I've learned immense things from. But in a very funny way, I certainly, when I wrote the original article, even though it doesn't refer to him or direct, well, maybe it uses something from him, I certainly thought, oh, he won't, this doesn't really go with his way of thinking, and never really thought anybody would find it of use in that way, right? So it kind of goes to, how does writing about something frame it, right? And that had sort of made me think it was outside of it. It didn't stop me from thinking this whole world, because for me, it's always like, this is the overwhelming approach to the overwhelming feeling in seeing the work is how much these thoughts came to me, right? And so I've always felt like you sort of act true and you work from the work forward and towards that, and then everything else kind of gets added in relationship to it to different extents. So I think that idea, though, isn't to say that this, I mean, and I think very clearly I put my sort of theory up front, right? I have this view of it, I have this framework, it's analytical. Many things could work in relationship to it. But I also think part of my, I don't know, my background, my relationship to architecture plays a role in this. I see it differently, but the fact that my background is exactly about crossing from philosophy into art and architecture, I feel like I've never held one of these things as a discipline, but as ways of thinking that sometimes emerge in different places. So that always transcended any given set of things. And I think I'm constantly looking for associations, right? More than I am, and the connections, and this work did it so powerfully for me in asking those questions, right? And its insistence on looking at that. So yeah, I think that gives some sense of that, because otherwise I think there's, you know, there's, when you write about something and somebody can read it who's created things, there's many different conversations you can have. So I've always hoped that mine, you know, just points to a set of things that I can find in the work and that are about being there, and the experience of it from somebody who doesn't have another connection, I guess.
Excellent.
A bit previously, a few years ago, my publisher published a book with a collection of essays and writings about different parts of my work that has maybe 20 or 25 essays, and they were mostly about one body of work or something like that. And I felt always, what's going to be next, or how can that go beyond that in a way? And because I never felt like, oh, no, I'm doing another body of work, or I have a new idea. It's not about ideas. It's more or less, for example, when I started to photograph, and then I decided to make the central perspectives, which was a spontaneous idea, or spontaneous conclusion, because it followed a period where I photographed a lot in the street with 35mm, and I realized, as I said before, that things slip out of my fingers. They just are anecdotal, and in the end they don't mean very much. So the central perspective seemed to be more analytical and make things more comparable and so forth. And then I switched to the new class of photography. It was Bernd Becher, and he introduced me to work with large format. So then I worked with large format, and it was a little bit on both sides to learn how photography works by just staying very strictly in a very little concise limitations, making the central perspectives within which things would happen and things became comparable. And I was very interested in the role of the unconscious in the creation of that, in that kind of atmosphere. Let's say a street in Paris, a street in Düsseldorf, a street in New York, a street in London, how that plays an important role aside from architects, planners, building law, you finance people, and so forth. And that was more or less about the culture of the street. And by accident, not by accident, but somehow when I became interested in portrait and photographing families, I realized that's like I knew that's a convention. So in a way, I also always, several times I didn't mind to use a conventional picture genre, because I realized my reasons for using them are totally different from what the genre initially meant.
Mhm.
Yeah, so the family portrait seemed to be like you're diving into the culture as a starting point of culture, which is a family and the first experience of living together with other people. Yeah, then with museum photographs, that had a little bit to do with how do we deal with history, or how do we spend time in a place that is not obviously useful, because it's not a soccer stadium, it's not a concert hall, it's not a university, a library, it's not an auditorium, it's a place where people go, not for religious reasons neither, but it's a place where people reflect and learn about themselves in reflection with interpretations that other people did previously. So in a way that had to do something with inside the family, but also inside the larger family, let's say, of the nation, of the belief, and all these things. And so really the things you have built upon each other by diving into things that I notice about myself, or about what it, what constitutes a human being, more or less. And I like how Nana, this is very funny, because that end of the book, which took 10 years, it ends with the brain, with that photograph of the brain, which sort of is, I thought it was all worth it, though that it took so long, because I had no idea when I started to write the book that I would photograph a brain. 5 years, 6 years later.
Oh.
That's a perfect demonstration of the convergence and autonomy of the project.
No, it's really like it was like a very slow motion ping pong, yeah, across the Atlantic.
Oh, that really represents a nice transition to the next question. And, I'll gear it at least to start towards Nana. One of the highlights of the book, particularly as we move into the assembly part of the book, is a focus on a theoretical project that re-examines subjectivity. So the book suggests that subjectivity no longer can be discussed solely within a social political framework, but simultaneously is tangled in matters of technology and biology. The photographs belonging to assembly suggest that it really isn't possible, if it ever was, to extract any one of these things from the other. To me, at least, this is a powerful claim. And it makes me a little bit melancholy, actually, as I observe our inability as a society, and or maybe a global set of societies, to find ourselves and one another in the complex techno, biological, or social assemblies that we've created for ourselves. So clearly that's a statement on my part. And it's the right of any reader, or as Thomas's photographs say, audience member, to interpret as they see fit. I am curious, would you be willing to address the idea of how the social techno-biological assembly manifests in the world, as you kind of discovered in the photography of Thomas Struth?
Yeah, I will, but I'm actually also curious to hear what Thomas has to say. But I mean, one of the things that's sparking that, right, is I think a couple of incredibly powerful images that were taken, I think around 2012, 2013, the figure ones. We show one in the cycle, and that's that image of surgery. And they're very different. The other one is, I think it's in the book. I can't remember, I'm sorry. Which is also a scene of surgery, but radically different. And then there's also other things that relate to this kind of question of replicating body parts or modeling things. So to me, it was like, wow, these really relate to, of course, people, but understanding the complex situations we're placed into and how we see ourselves. And so a kind of image that certainly sort of with the brain, but certainly one never could expect looking at the other images of people from who are presenting themselves, who are in position to present themselves. So something very different happens, and then they're very dramatic in a certain way, one being smaller scale and a kind of somewhat reminiscent of the lighting, at least that you get in anatomy theater paintings, where it's darker and the lit center, and this kind of relationship to new forms of surgery. And to me, exactly in at least the one of them is kind of caught between a kind of robotic arm and the everyday, more usual techniques of scalpels and things by surgeons. And I find these very questioning, finding these places and seeing how people are placed. But also, I think there's quite a number of places where, and it's exactly with the confrontation with a lot of the images of technology. How are we situated in relationship? How do we read that? So whether or not people are shown in those images, they exist very strongly. That the image was presented in that way and created, but also in the myriad ways. And when you see people have to try to position themselves to this and to what you understand and what you don't, and what literally in taking a photograph, what you're positioned in relationship to. And so I think that's really a kind of amazing thing, that these photographs take us into places we would never get to and transport us in that sense, like the Max Planck Institute or CERN or a whole series of these things that are actively involved in our world, because they have to be considered as a regular part of it in so many ways, along with the whole sort of positioning of what we do with these technologies, or how we see them, or what we understand, and I think hopefully, I guess I have a kind of hope that some of even the things that make these, the sort of science and relationship becomes more broadly discussed also, and commonly understood. Like we don't just view everything as like we don't get it, but there becomes to be a language of discussion in which is much broader in society to address things and begin to recognize them. So I see a lot of things entering into these parts, but certainly that issue of subjectivity comes home very directly with the couple of images of from these advanced surgeries.
It's very helpful to hear that. And Thomas, would you like to talk about that a bit?
Yeah, I mean, you're right. Now it's a very different situation, because you see every day, when I buy the newspaper or you go online, you see these heartbreaking and mind-breaking photographs of the war in the Ukraine, with unbelievable. It's unbelievably depressing what's happening, and how you have to relate to that, and the way I see, on one hand, you see how can how can lies be believed when the globe is surrounded by thousands of satellite cameras who photograph everything that's happening down here, and you have the internet and people, the distribution of photographs and information is still, Russia and China. You're not talking about North Korea or Hungary, or people try to control it, and you manipulate people. And Trump tried it, and the Republicans still do. It's very scary. It's very scary, and I was born in '54. Just 9 years after the end of World War II, and my father was a soldier in Hitler's army. And we experienced the separation of Germany over 44 years, and peaceful reunification thanks to also Russia and America and France. And now it seems to be that the world has, despite all the technology and despite all the hopes and the promises, it feels like the world hasn't learned anything. The world has not learned anything. And does the next technology round do anything? And I'm not against technology. I'm just one shouldn't make false promises. I don't know what Elon Musk thinks. Yeah, we should build a city on Mars or so. Are you kidding? It's bullshit.
Yeah.
It's certainly distracting for many people. And it means, I'm doing a very general statement, but it's, since I use photography, since I make photographs, when I see photographs of the destruction in Bucha nearby Kiev, and the dead bodies, it's difficult to believe that there's a, I wonder what the solution will be of this.
Yeah.
And of course, I'm sick and tired of your authoritarian structures and these men who must be deep inside kind of dwarfs, and I don't want to offend any dwarfs, but people who are really small and need to pump up their egos, and they're just their false justifications like that. Yeah, at the price of many people dying, and it's astonishing. So
yeah, thank you. I mean, just thank you, and underscores the project, the larger project of non-separation being such a light in a world where that is hard.
Yeah, I'm just astonished. I don't want to talk about the Green Party in Germany now, but I thought for many years I've been thinking, oh, finally there's a project that will bring us together. So that we have to, and it's so exciting because it's happening as well. So there's the solar energy, there's heat pump, there's a lot of inventions. People have to come up with new ideas. Also, it's actually a fantastic, constructive, positive opportunity, but it's it's also what came up in my mind when I listened was that in a way, technology has become increasingly invisible. Like the internet is not really visible, and the pandemic, the virus, is not visible, and sort of it's almost as if on the eve of, not on the eve, I didn't start that so early, but that it's still presenting technology as sculpture, as something that the brains and the corporations and assemblies of people constructed by their brain power and by their joint efforts. And when the World Wide Web, there's just a town where Tim Berners-Lee worked as a plaque at his former office that says Sears Web. Tim Berners-Lee invented the internet, the World Wide Web.
Well, and these reflections make me think back to Nana's earlier observation that some of your current and recent work really allows us access to sites and that are inaccessible to the broader public. So sort of, I'd love to hear you maybe further this line of thinking in terms of what it has meant for you to inhabit these laboratories of advanced technology and science as a site of operation. There's a striking immersive quality of many of those pictures, and also some moments where the push and pull between the difficulty of making sense of the image, as Nana suggested, and yet sometimes the ad hoc nature of the assemblies we're looking at that feel very fragile and often somewhat belated in their construction. Anyway, I'd love to hear you talk a little bit more about what it's meant to operate within these various spaces of the sites that you've been operating in.
Is that a question to me?
Yes, yeah. Thinking about the laboratory as a kind of broadly defined site that your photographic work has returned to.
Well, it started more or less with my thoughts about this problem between the physical, the interpretation of the physical world versus the non-physical world. The soul, like the psychology, the soul, the myth, the belief, everything that's not controllable in a certain way, and that's a very big part of the existence. As soon as people talk to each other, start to talk to each other. Somebody says something, the other person understands something different. So, I mean, everybody knows what's that about. It's what constitutes human existence in a way, and then this fandom or this constant bet on technology, and I started in 2 places in Cape Canaveral because I was nearby doing a workshop at the Atlantic Center for the Arts for 3 weeks, and then in the end I thought, oh, I'm going to go to Cape Canaveral because it's nearby, and I found that very interesting. And I didn't at that time. I just tried to apply to get in, which was very difficult, and I had no idea what. So finally, when I got, after a long time, I got somebody on the phone from NASA. He said to me, "So what do you want to photograph?" And I said, "Well, what can I photograph?" And he said, "Well, you could photograph the repair of a space shuttle." And I thought, wow, you got to be kidding. This is much more than I expected. And then the other one, the second one had to do with plasma physics, with the idea to create a new method to make energy that works like apparently what is a kind of a model of what happens in the sun, which of course was a fantastic subject matter. So I reached out to Max Planck institutes, one in Garching nearby Munich and other one in Greifswald, and I worked there. And so slowly that began, and I found that people who work in research, that's at 99 or almost 100% of the cases, were very supportive people where I feel a lot of gratitude, because they're also a little bit like artists, because they work into the unknown. Yeah, they don't know what's going to happen next week, and then so somebody in plasma physics, there's people who have been directors of these institutes for, let's say, 20 or 30 years, and the progress they made was, it may be this or that, but it's still not working. So it also has to deal with, it has to do with, you're not failing, but the disappointment or things like that, or things don't happen as you wish they would have. So these people have been extremely open, supportive, and helpful to me to an unbelievable degree. And they always explain, what they're doing so that I can understand a little bit. I regret, in retrospect, that I did not always record everything what they were telling me to listen to it. And I know, of course, I've learned a lot about technology, so one thing is the technology itself and the people who work on it, and the other thing is this promise thing, which is not done by the people who actually work on it. That's the promise is the politics.
Thank you.
Even though people are excited, but they are not, the people by and large who work on these things, they don't fool themselves. Like they don't make this promise. They don't, you make false assumptions or false promises.
And I wonder if that maybe those reflections create an opening for you, Nana, to think a little bit about where your work, you both intersect in thinking about through this project and have continued on in your own trajectories to develop work since the book. So how some of these threads have fueled your thinking right now, Nana, on the big data project might be helpful to kind of think through in relationship to this extended conversation that you've had with Thomas.
Yeah, I very much like something that came up in this last little discussion about seeing what isn't seen, right? What's invisible, what isn't there. And one of the things that interests me about big data is it enters a realm where you simply can't see it. It's a dealing with patterns and scale of thinking and of various bits of data, for lack of a better word, or maybe that's just the right word, that and seeing patterns that humans can't see. That's where it enters. And to me, I'm very interested in exactly that's a moment. It's another work that's a kind of trajectory of a way of thinking to that. I guess that's what I do. I don't know. But very much interested in how we've reached a stage, and by architects, but sort of everybody, although I focus on within architecture, where this is just absorbed without knowing what it is. And that there's different modes of the absorption. One is to focus on the technological, almost as its controlling factor in data and things like that. And then the other is to say, yes, we just use whatever bits of software we have and do whatever else. And it seems to me that I see signs of both of those is a real sign that we've missed something that's already transpired. And I'm trying to look at, see what that is and make it out there, make it visible, make it discussable, and try to figure out what are the terms of that discussion. So for me, it's a kind of marking of the way thought has changed from a kind of language text-based version to a sort of algorithm-driven version of where we imagine, and that resituates the human. Like the human is very different as a reader than as following an algorithm. And I would love that to be part of a larger discussion. And Andrew has become part of this because of, we used to talk to him about many of these things. And then I was like, well, maybe we just should work on this together, because he also has a different scale and he has a much better sense of big data in some ways. And he uses it more in his work in some other sense, but also the scale of the city, but also that we were already having a discussion, and it was very informative to me. So yeah, in that way, that's where I am at this moment.
Thanks, Nana. And I think, you know, given the time, I would love to open this up to our audience. And I think, as I do, and we can do this by voice or by text or by chat, I'll just say to you, Nana, yeah, I think one of the things that I really liked about everything, of the many things in the book was the way that you did keep returning to the original set of central perspective urban photos. And I know that that's my preoccupation, but I think that issue of invisibility and what is hidden in those and yet manifest at the same time after reading your book is really powerful, and a compelling thing for designers and planners to really think about as we look at what we should be doing going forward. So I appreciate that so very much. Does anyone have any questions in the audience? Sanda, I see you raising your hand.
Yeah, unmute myself. First of all, thank you so much for these introductions, and thank you for Andrew and Sheila and Thomas and Nana for making this possible. I am fascinated by the photographs. I guess my question that comes in is, in some of the photographs, I sense a sense of melancholy, a sense of loss that seems to me part of the way we judge the world and the way we judge ourselves and the way we feel in the world as biological and perhaps somewhat technological creatures as well. And in terms of that melancholy, for me, it goes to Aristotle's melas, which of course means darkness, obscurity. And photography is really about darkness and lightness. It's actually drawing with light. So I find that so compelling, how Thomas is able to draw with light and make visible things that otherwise wouldn't exist for us, both inaccessible in terms of sights, but also they wouldn't exist the way that photography reveals them to be. And that is not only technological sites of NASA and plasma laboratories or high-end surgery, but also just a very everyday scene in the city, sort of an urban scene in the city. And I'm wondering if your view of the technology that we have today is amenable to in any way some kind of judgment and that have to do with human evaluative judgments. For example, is it beneficial? In what ways? Is it very problematic, and in what ways? I mean, technology can help us solve so many of the environmental issues, the ecological issues that we have. At the same time, technology makes propaganda and lies very, very accessible to people and very amenable, and a kind of manipulation can happen through technology on a scale that wasn't possible before. It was absolutely impossible. So I was just wondering what your thoughts might be on the sort of value of technology in an ethical sense, if you will.
You know, photography is definitely something that has to do with with the resting time, or not wanting to things to disappear. I think, and I sometimes, over the years, I asked myself if one would interview, try to research all the photographers in history who were really like photographic authors, so to speak, if they what the issue of death means to them, and whether they have any experience, of course not experience with it, but how they're related to that. I was sometimes wondering what would be the outcome of such a questionnaire. And in a way, of course, photography, popular photography in magazines and and the television also is very often about so-called happiness or something, entertaining and stuff like that. So that's already being done by other people, and it's not. I don't need to do that because that I find that is not a lasting. These are just moments that appear and they disappear. They come and go, and I'm always interested in doing something that stays. And for example, even in the photographs in New York City that I took in '78, of course the cars don't exist anymore, or they're very old cars, and the buildings, of course, in New York is not anymore what it's like in my photographs, but because the composition refrains, so to speak, from taste, or like, that's a nice angle and that's a nice angle. They're more systematic. That's one thing that they express. Is the systematic observation of something, and the ones that are going through right now that I made later when I returned to photographing architecture, they just came about because I had so much more experience in identifying, generally speaking, locations, which initially I just didn't have the life's experience to have seen enough of the world to be able to think through what I wanted to show as an exemplary situation, like that photograph before of Ulsan with all the apartment blocks and the mountains behind. It speaks about eating landscape. You see this eat landscape or you eat ground.
Thank you. Yeah, there's something so regenerative about, you talk about the experience of having done something for a long time, and the kind of wisdom and embodied sort of knowledge that can bring to an artist such as yourself of the world and of his medium.
Yeah, I mean, this is also when I think about for example, the photographing in cities. There's certain cities that really have changed my life. To be there, like in New York, in Düsseldorf, of course, just to start with, and in New York when I was there in '78 for 9 months, in Edinburgh, where I encountered a culture where people are so many people are so knowledgeable about the history of their own country or their own people, and how that the architecture of Edinburgh just it fascinated. It was hard for me to believe how something like that can exist, like a city that's built of one stone in an agreed style, so to speak. It's just so fascinating. And the people I met there, being in Naples in 1988, I really, each time I dove into the city and exposed myself to the place and the people quite a bit, and just lived there. I had the feeling that I really lived there for, even though it was only, let's say, 10 weeks or 5 weeks or so. And that is embedded in these pictures, in my opinion.
Nana, do you have any concluding thoughts as we celebrate the launch of the project?
Just really to thank all the other participants, and particularly Sheila, you and Andrew, for, I think, really making and framing a great discussion that I found very informative and made me think, which I appreciate. And so I really appreciate all of that and the thoughtfulness behind that. And whenever I have a kind of conversation with Thomas, I always hear some new set of things in relation to them. So I love that opportunity. So thank you.
Yeah, I'm very interested. I'm very curious about your big data book. Yeah, I think that's very. I mean, the question is how the individual in the assembly of a society deals, sort of lives with it, or can, what will happen, how it will, how it's shaping our your perception, and how we get maybe used to rely on it or being controlled by it, and so forth. So I think it's a very important, it's a very important topic. So I'm curious to and intrigued what that will be like, your book.
Well, the goal is certainly to have that completed in much less time, and especially, I don't think I need to wait for more to happen to sort of do that.
No.
As waiting, I mean, initially, certainly with this book, with you, it was just great to see the added things. It really worked in time. But yeah, so I'm looking forward to what I have to say on big data too.
So with that, I think that's the perfect way to suggest perhaps we could all find ourselves back together, maybe even dare to dream in person for a follow-up conversation with Andrew and Nana and Thomas in the future with a return. So thank you so much to all of you for joining us, especially Thomas for for zooming in with us.
Thank you so much. I really enjoyed it. Bye.